Thanks for listening to this podcast of Trending with Timmerie. If you haven't already subscribed, please catch us wherever you love to listen to your podcast, from the Relevant Radio app to Apple, YouTube, you name it, we are there. And if you listen on Apple Podcasts, please be sure to go and give us a 5-star review to help other people discover the podcast. Anything you share in terms of episodes, whether it's texting it to a friend, posting on social media, helps to build up the kingdom for God, to help confront the challenging issues we face as a culture, but with joy, with hope, and with an eternal perspective where our faith collides with everyday life, bringing eternal principles to help us live our life joyfully.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio.
It's International Women's Day, and if you're like me, you're probably wondering, what on earth does that even mean to us? It seems as if there's an international day for everything from donuts to women. Hey, there's an International Men's Day as well. I think that was a few months back. But it tends to be that there's a little more attention given to this day in the face of the fight over so-called equality, abortion, and so-called women's rights, many of which we could dive into today. I do have a question for you, and I really am curious what you think, and not just women needing to weigh in on this. Do you believe that there are any fights ahead of women today where they are still battling for equality? Are there any areas in society where women are fighting for equal status with men? I really am curious what you think, and I'll share my thoughts on this in a few minutes. But if you have a thought, the number is 1-888-914-9149, and you can especially answer this question on Instagram. I put it up on my Instagram story. Follow me at Timmerie, Timmerie. We're also going to discuss struggles women face today in society. I think it's a fascinating question, so if you have something to share, fantastic. We'll also discuss the gifts of women in understanding the feminine genius and how Our Lady, the Blessed Virgin Mary, is the model of femininity. If you have a question today, the number is 1-888-914-9149, but please do leave your questions and comments on Instagram. I put that question box up on my story. Follow me at Timmerie, Timmerie. Okay, with it being International Women's Day, it is one of those days where I do browse through Twitter, and I'm not one to do this a ton. I think that Twitter can be just an infuriating place for polarizing ideas that, yes, can be both informative to see trends, but also at times just a rabbit hole of distraction. But days like today, I am curious to see, what is the pulse? What are, average people saying in response to this proclaimed International Women's Day? And one tweet in particular that really resonated with many people. For some, International Women's Day what it was originally meant to be, and that is a celebration of women, especially women in our families, especially our female leaders and peers and those whom we greatly admire. Now, unfortunately, International Women's Day has been hijacked by the pro-LGBTQ, radical pro-abortion, and pro-contraception culture, where women are chanting, "I can do anything, you can do better," against men. But it's gone even further than that. The focus, especially this year for International Women's Day, with their campaign, is it's all about gender and trying to get rid of any biases, stereotypes, or as they view biases and stereotypes that are ultimately discrimination. And so the hashtag this year is #BreakTheBias. And it's funny because there are all these people with masks on and their arms crossed over each other trying to prove their point that we need to break the bias, and that is them taking their stand by standing as women with their arms crossed, or trying to identify as women if they believe that they've taken some cross-sex hormones or physically manipulated their bodies, that they think that gives them female status. It's amazing what we're seeing out there today on that front. But here's the tweet that I found absolutely fascinating, that I think in many ways sums up the crisis, but also the dilemma personally that each and every single woman faces today. The tweet resonates with many of the posts I saw, and it said this: girls can do anything. Celebrate women today. Simple. And I was really thinking about this. Okay, girls, women can do anything. I take extreme, I think, question and offense at this idea, because what that means is that women are really nothing because we're trying to be everything. And when people say women can do anything, I really do wonder, are they saying that women can do anything, or are they saying what we've seen the culture has chosen to do, that women can do everything? Because it's a lie to say that women can do anything. We can't. Unless you believe in a feminist version of pop culture that is not reality, such as Beyonce feminism, or Ariana Grande talking about how God is a woman and essentially this goddess perspective of women, we can't do everything. We're making ourselves gods. But I think on the other side of it, when people say women can do anything, what they're saying is, A, that's a lie, because we can't. We're limited. We're finite. We're dependent on the very fact that God creates us into existence at every single moment. And without his intentional love and creation, we would not be breathing or living at this moment. But I think when people say that women can do anything, they're often saying, well, women can do everything. We are capable of doing anything and everything. And there is something so profound about that statement. On one side, yes, as women have risen to the occasion time and time again. And we see this, that the radical feminist movement grew on the back of World War II, when during World War II, what we saw is that women who were at home while the men were away fighting, that they at that time were picking up the slack, helping to make sure that crops and fields were being taken care of so that the nation ate. They were in the factories. They were doing the work necessary in order to keep it through manual labor, a nation fed, a nation functioning, so that when our soldiers came back, they had a nation that could return to its former glory, and even more so. And so what we saw, though, is that there was this challenge in the culture, that we saw this is how incredible women are. They have risen to the occasion. We even see this in wartime, when at times women are called, yes, to help do jobs that are traditionally masculine. But even, there was this story that broke last week talking about how even some of the massive pageant women, I can't remember what her name was, but one of, Miss Ukraine, and this beautiful woman who is, won all these beauty contests, that here she is, she has a rifle in her arms, and she is battling to help protect the people of Ukraine against the invasion of Russia. Oh, this example is the example that women, when called to rise to the occasion and fill the shoes that they need to fill. But the challenge as a culture for us as women is, do we really have to do everything at all times? And is there anything specifically unique to us as women that perhaps we should make sure we continue to value and fight for? And I think that this is fascinating to think about, this idea of women can do anything or everything. I think that what we've seen as a culture is that we are struggling with implosion for many women, where because we've been told that we can do everything, we overtax ourselves, overcommit ourselves, overwork, work when perhaps we shouldn't, are trying to raise families, have full-time jobs, progress in career, do every after-school extracurricular activity with our kids. We're at the implosion point. We've seen in many of the studies today that in the face of so many rights and so-called women's liberation, that at the same time, women today are less happy than they ever were before in society. And so what I want to talk about today, to help us understand where we're at and what's happening, is the beauty of who we are and the beauty of our humanity. And again, it's a reminder for us that we can't just do everything. We are finite. We're dependent upon God creating us. We're dependent upon the nature he gave us. And we're also dependent upon the goal, the end goal for the human person that he has in store for us. We have a function For women, that's feminine. We have a purpose. That is to be with God in eternity. I was thinking about it. For us as women, we can do a lot and we can do it really well. And it's incredible to see, as I talked about the World War II generation of women stepping up, it's incredible to see what we can do, but we're not goddesses as pop culture tries to make us believe. Again, that Beyonce feminism, to Ariana Grande, God as a woman, this idea of elevating women, sometimes we get it wrong. And what's fascinating is that there's this desire to divinize femininity. In a certain respect, that's right. In the respect that we are created in God's image and likeness, that we are created to be like God and to be with God. But rather than lying to ourselves and saying that we can do everything and everything, we need to turn to the future generation ourselves, and we have to tell the truth. We have to tell the truth about the gifts of women, and ultimately what St. John Paul II coined, a phrase referring to the feminine genius, the great value of women. And I think the first and best place to start is by talking about the very complementarity between male and female, as God intended from the beginning. It's interesting when Jesus is asked questions about marriage and divorce and various things, he refers back to the beginning in Genesis, those first couple of chapters where we read both our human anthropology and theology, that God created us a male and female, and that we were created to be fruitful and multiply, that we were called to marriage. And I think of a quote from St. John Paul II's Theology of the Body, that speaks so deeply into the human anthropology that complements the theology of the human person, and especially women. He said, the dignity and balance of human life depends at every moment of history and in every longitude and latitude upon who man will be for woman and who women will be for men. So what he's saying is the very balance of society, the very balance of civilization, the very balance of history, of how we look back at history, how we view the human person, all of that rests upon this complementarity of who man will be for women and who women will be for men. So if who we are in terms of complementing one another as male and female, that is, when I talk about complementarity, the way we relate to one another as men and women, that demands that we have a strong level of self-knowledge and that we essentially do follow a quest of self-discovery, to know ourselves, to love ourselves, because we know and love God, and that leads us to being able to know and love our neighbor. But that requires that self-knowledge, that self-discovery, that requires that we as women have humility, that we have time of silence to ponder our own femininity, that we have time to pray before our Lord and discover who we are before the heavenly King, to ponder, for example, the pinnacle of creation, the Blessed Virgin Mary, to study women in civilizations today, 100 years ago, and 1,000 years ago. How do we view women in various cultures? What resonates and remains the same? You see, all of this calls for a pondering, a reflective time, but also that we learn so many things about ourselves when we also take all of that knowledge and we enter into relationship with others. First with God, and then with those closest to us. This is why when we get married, if you are called to marriage, if you are married, there should be a greater understanding of yourself rather than a loss of self and ugliness of yourself coming out. Isn't that the challenge in marriage? That for so many people, the idea of marrying, after a couple years in, some people start to feel numb and empty, like they've lost themselves. And others, I was just talking to someone the other day, they were saying in marriage that their spouse brings out the best in them. That's what marriage should be, this transformation of who we are, this complementary. Does that mean it's easy? No. But as we enter deeper and deeper into our vocation as women, we should have a greater sense of self-knowledge and self-discovery. And with that, peace, joy, love, hope, orienting us toward life with God. You see, our very understanding of our femaleness matters not only to ourselves, but it matters to all of civilization. And that's why this quote from St. John Paul II is so important when he says, the dignity and balance of human life depends at every moment of history and in every longitude and latitude upon who man will be for women and who women will be for men. I think often when we talk about femininity and masculinity, I think about a comment made, a quote of St. John Paul II of the Russian author Dostoevsky. When Dostoevsky said, beauty will save the world, and St. John Paul II has reiterated that in some of his work and writings. And I remember I had thought before, well, what does that even mean? Because St. John Paul II, when quoting Dostoevsky, would refer to this idea of beauty saving the world as an idea that women will save the world. And I remember when I was younger, I used to think, well, I kind of take offense at that because that means, it puts pressure on us as a society. We think beauty means, how hot and available we look as women at any given time in the culture. But when he said beauty will save the world, yes, he was referring to women, but he was referring to who we are. The beauty within of the human person, of both the creation and the intention for us as women, but also who we are capable of being. Not just the compilation of body parts and how others perceive us. Oh, it's funny, I always think when I think about beauty and this confusion about beauty, I think of the challenge we have in the culture surrounding sexuality, that we view beauty as so important to the human eye, which it is, but we reduce it to that. I remember one time the chastity speaker, Jason Everett, when I was in high school, gave a talk. He was talking about how when he walked into the men's restroom one day, above the sink, there was this image of a bunch of women's legs lined up in a row. It is a bunch of women's legs lined up in a row. And very beautiful, nice, shapely women's legs. And he said something along the lines of, I wonder if I were to walk into the women's restroom and look up above the mirrors and the sinks, if there would just be a nice bunch of hairy, manly legs in a row. I said, you would never see that. And that always stood out to me, of understanding this whole issue of beauty, that yes, beauty is so important and perceivable to the eye, but the beauty of femininity, the beauty of who women are, penetrates so much deeper than just looks. And that's why when St. John Paul II, quoting Dostoevsky, says beauty will save the world, and he's referring to women, he's referring to the fullness of who we are as women, and that feminine genius and the gifts we have as women to offer the world. And so you're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. I'm going to come back talking about this feminine genius. I'm going to discuss the gifts as women that we have. We'll discuss challenges women face today, as well as answer and ask this question. I'd love to hear from you on Instagram. Share your thoughts at Timmerie, Timmerie. I put a question box up there. Are there any things today that women are fighting for when it comes to equality? Are there any battles we still have ahead? We'll also discuss how Mary is the model of femininity. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. I will be right back today on International Women's Day. This hour is sponsored by Solidarity Health Share. Join thousands of members who choose life through ethical and affordable healthcare. Check now to see how much you can save. Go to CatholicHealthShare.com.
Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
Are there any battles ahead of women today for equality? I'm curious to hear your thoughts. Go ahead and comment now on my Instagram story, or you can give me a call. The number's 1-888-914-9149. I'll also discuss challenges women face today. It's International Women's Day. You do not have to be a woman to stick with us. We're talking about the gifts of women, the feminine genius, challenges we face, and how Mary is the model of femininity. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. Again, I would love to hear your thoughts today on the topic. Again, there seems to be an international day for everything from donuts to women. No comparison there. Don't take offense at that. But I do find it interesting because this day has been hijacked by a radical form of feminism. And I would like and hope that we could shift the narrative to embrace much of what St. John Paul II himself has exposed and taught us, in pushing forward the idea of a feminine genius. Many people will write to me over and over again saying, okay, but what is the feminine genius? The idea behind the feminine genius is for us to understand that as women, we have a tremendous number of gifts to offer the world. And at a time, St. John Paul II was writing as there was a battle for legal equality, at least in the West, that did in many respects need to be achieved. But he also would talk about essentially the balance that as women were coming into greater involvement in the world than ever before, at the same time, women needed to be present in helping humanity and not falling, and bringing the spirit of the gospel in the midst of the massive and ongoing transformation that the world was seeing. He cites the document from the Second Vatican Council talking about women in his work, Mulieris Dignitatem, that is on the dignity and vocation of women. And St. John Paul II, in citing this document, says the hour is coming, in fact has come, when the vocation of women is being acknowledged in its fullness. That hour in which women acquire in the world an influence, an effect, and a power never hitherto achieved. But again, he emphasized that balance of what would happen in society and continuing to stay faithful to the gospel also meant that women were meant to aid humanity in not falling. And so what I want to talk now about is what in Mulieris Dignitatem, that is this letter of St. John Paul II, what he talks about in the feminine genius, and talk about what some of those gifts of femininity themselves are. And in pondering the gift of femininity, I kept thinking about how we as women counterbalance what's happening in the culture today. We either have the opportunity to aid and usher in the crisis of identity and ideology today that's hijacking who we are as human beings, or we have the opportunity to counterbalance it in a culture of ambiguity, in a culture void of God, void of relationship and understanding of the Creator, and that we have a purpose. And the face of a culture that's gotten rid of God and has ignored right from wrong, that in that moment, that this is where we are as women, and we have the opportunity to enter into this debate, this ideological crisis, and ultimately the very question of existence that many people are asking. Who am I? What am I made for? How can I be happy? Is God real? And is there any purpose or meaning to life? Genevieve Kainck, in a comment that she made when talking about St. John Paul II's Mulieris Dignitatem, she said this, and I think it's so profound. She said, the vocation of women is to establish sanctuaries of love and life amidst the shattering reverberation of the world's darker inclinations. That we as women, so to paraphrase that we as women are called to, all women universally, to establish sanctuaries of love and life amidst the shattering reverberation of the world's darker inclinations. She goes on to say, in these sanctuaries, the human person and his or her needs are paramount, and the place therein creates an echo of the divine order itself. So what she's saying is that women are meant to create these safe havens, these sanctuaries for the human person to grow even in the face of the confusing pockets in society. And that there, women will help to minister to men and women their needs of all ages at a paramount time in society. And that in those homes, in those sanctuaries, that the Creator himself will be echoed, that will understand the divine order. This is what we're talking about, is that women help to create homes. Women are what make a home. Any bachelor man who's unmarried for a time and then gets married can speak to this, that a woman helps to make a home. Not just with decorations and comfort, but with the tenderness and love that we are called to in our very humanity. It's interesting because when we talk about the gifts of women, One of the great gifts of femininity is to see the other person. St. Edith Stein, who lived during World War II and actually died in Auschwitz, is a convert from Judaism. She was an absolute agnostic atheist, eventually became a Catholic nun, a Carmelite, and she died along with her biological sister, who also converted to Catholicism and became a religious sister, a Carmelite. They both died in Auschwitz during World War II, and St. Edith Stein was an incredible philosopher and ultimately phenomenologist. And St. Edith Stein said, when talking about many of the gifts of women, she said, women naturally seek to embrace what is living, personal, and whole. In other words, women seek to embrace the whole person that is living, personal, and whole. And let me give you an example of this. I remember a number of years ago when some of my friends had been getting married, and one of my friends had, a kid that was about, 7-ish years old. And the husband came home, saw the little girl after work and after her day at school, and could clearly, is looking at her and saying, hey, how you doing? How was your day? And she said, fine. She goes to her bedroom, proceeds to kind of be a little off. He doesn't notice anything. She looks fine. She says she's fine. She must be fine. His wife comes, sees the little girl, and he's like, what's wrong? What's wrong with Genevieve? Like, what's going on with her? And he's like, what? She's fine. She looks fine. She said she's fine. She ate, she ate. What are you talking about? She said, something's clearly wrong. And in that moment, it's an example of how, as women, we tend to see the wholeness of the human person. Not that men don't, but there's this penetrating depth in knowledge and intuition that women have. As St. Edith Stein said, also known as St. Teresa Benedicta of the Cross, should women naturally seek to embrace what is living, personal, and whole. Women have a gift to see other human beings and penetrate to the very depth of the human person. St. Edith Stein has commented that women in society, homes, workplaces should and are at the heart of helping people from atrophying. And she talks about how this is one of the great benefits of women in the workplace, or what should be one of the great benefits of women in the workplace. That a woman's presence, that interaction, that dynamic, the loving intentionality to other human beings should help prevent things such as workaholism, should help prevent people from becoming machines in the workplace, but instead human beings who are created for love. That a woman's presence, whether it be in the home or the workplace, society, education, politics, at the heart of it is she's helping the human person from atrophying. That is our calling as women. Yet how easy is it for us to fall in the opposite direction, to deny and reject this very portion of our femininity, to just allow ourselves to become shrewd, demanding, gossips, and critical. This is a part of the challenge of our human nature, that as a result of the fall, we have what is known as concupiscence, this tendency towards sin. And that tendency towards sin, remember, when we sin, we act against the very nature and creation and intention of who we are, created in the image and likeness of God. St. Edith Stein says women naturally seek to embrace what is living, personal, and whole. Women naturally seek to embrace what is living, personal, and whole. In the study of femininity versus masculinity, we know that men tend to gravitate more so toward systems, and women tend to gravitate more so to living human beings. There's nothing wrong with that. Much of this has to do with the fact that men continue to keep society functioning in many areas that women do not, and vice versa. And we see our gifts come out in this. I remember I've had the opportunity to dance with a little sensitive topic here, but the Russian ballet company known as the Kirov in Washington, D.C. And I've danced, many places, especially throughout California for years. I've taught dance, and I've worked with some of the top level dancers in the world. And I remember two friends of mine who were some of the top dancers, Martha and Toby in San Diego. They phenomenal story. They end up getting married, and there was an interview done between the two of them. They're both choreographers and run a dance studio now, and there was a conversation in the interview that had to do with, what are your gifts the two of you offer as artistic directors at a dance company now? And they were talking about how the husband is more so oriented toward the system and the technique of everything, and how the wife sees, yes, the technique and the gifts and the performance, but she sees, that personification of the human person in performance. She sees the personal growth and dimension side of the individual dancers. And I thought it was such a profound example of how the two still in their femininity and their masculinity are working to bring out the beauty of the arts in the younger generation, but at the same time you're seeing their femininity and masculinity come out in a very profound way, even in dancing. And so what we're talking about when we discuss this gift that women have that St. Edith Stein says, she then goes on at a certain point in her work, Essays on Women, she talks about how women have this gift to cherish, guard, protect, nourish, and advance our is part of our natural maternal yearning. That is fundamental to femininity is our capacity to cherish, guard, protect, nourish, and advance growth in ourselves and others. That it's very natural for women to desire that protection, that nourishment, that advancement, both in us, but also in other people. And that by doing that, that's a part of living in the very nature and gifts that we have as women. And what's important to understand, because someone might listen, and you might be with me right now and say, okay, well, you'd have to be a wife or a mother to nourish, protect, guard, and advance growth in another human being. But you see, this is the vocation of all women. This is the feminine genius. It's not for wives alone. It's not for mothers alone. This is the very gift of what it means to be women. Let's talk about some concrete examples. We as women have a great capacity and gift to compliment other people, to affirm them, to give those compliments. Or, juxtaposed to that, our temptation and sometimes our challenges, we tend to, instead of living up to our fullest potential, to compliment and affirm others. It's very easy for us to criticize and nag and tear down other people bitingly with a simple word. I see it in my own home. One simple word I could say to my husband could cut him to the core so easily. And yet a simple few words can also build him up and encourage him and affirm him. We also, as women, have a gift to build community. At the same time, it's so easy for us to be divisive and gossip and create those divisions and fail to include people. If you think about when you were a child, when you went to someone's home, who was it that made you feel welcome? Who helped to nourish you? Who helped to make sure you knew where the bathroom was, you were comfortable, if you needed to call your parents? It was the mom. The mother of the home helps in building that community, of building that inclusion. Yet we have the same capacity and ability to divide and gossip. This is the challenge of our femininity in the face of sin, in the face of concupiscence, that we can either live according to the fullness of our nature, or we can fall, ignore, and step away from who we are as women, and criticize, nag, divide, and gossip. Another great gift we have as women is compassion and mercifulness. We refer to Our Lady as clement. To be clement means to be merciful. We talked about this last week during our marriage hour, how Our Lady is a model for all Christian spouses in her clemency and in her mercifulness. Isn't this what we desire in our spouse, that unconditional love? That we're not sitting here thinking, oh man, if I do X, I'm really going to pay for this, and my spouse is going to resent me. No, instead we should know that even in the face of mistakes, that our spouse is forgiving and gentle and kind. This is what we should personify as women. Instead, we tend to struggle, whether it be in the home, in the workplace, or even with our children, with being shrewd and harsh. Again, this isn't meant to criticize us as women. It's meant to see the great capacity we have for complementarity, for affirmation, for building community, for compassion and mercy, and to reject the very ideas that tend to be permeating in culture to define women. It's interesting, over the last 20 years in third wave feminism, part of third wave feminism is this idea of being a nasty lady. You've heard this, even with those nasty hats that people wear on their heads during the women's marches. This idea that nastiness should be embraced, that shrewdness should be embraced, that harshness should be embraced. Well, whether you're male or female, none of those things should be something to be embraced. Those characteristics are not distinctly masculine and are not distinctly meant to be imitated. And so that brings us to some of the challenges we face as a culture. It's fascinating. I've heard from so many of you, and I would love to hear from you more. What challenges do you believe that we face as women today? And also, do you believe, if any, are there areas where women are or should be still fighting for equality in the West? You're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio. We're touching on a topic that I remember covering a couple months ago, where I asked, what are the challenges women face today? I did actually a whole show talking about the crises surrounding education and how we need to balance and nuance the conversation about education and student loans and goals we have as women. But many of the responses came in fascinated me. And at the heart of this, I asked two questions, and this is the challenge. What challenges do women face in society today? And I'd love to hear your thoughts, so share it on Instagram at Timmerie, that's Timmerie. The question is, do we value ourselves enough as women? We know that often our society does not, but do we value ourselves enough as women? And are we living in a fragmented way, doing anything and everything, exhausting ourselves, being too busy? It's funny, I was watching a comedian on Instagram a couple months ago, and he's pretending to be basically a millennial woman today, and she said, I'm just so busy, I don't have time for anything. I'm starting my second company. I'm also working on this nutritional company on the side that I already started. I'm making sure that I get to my yoga class every single day, and I also just finished my second certification on leadership. And she goes on and on and on and on about all these things she's doing, and I'm just so busy. At a certain point, you listen, you hear everything she's accomplishing, great, fantastic accomplishments, but to what end? I think that one of the crises for us as women today is we're stuck in this wheel of progress, and this progress is eating away at us. That progress is the very opposite of femininity. That progress is great, but we lose ourselves when that's all we focus on. We atrophy as human beings. And so I want to hear from you. What challenges do you see women face today? And do you believe there are any fights for equality that we still have ahead of us in the West and the developed nations? You're listening to Trending with Timmerie today on International Women's Day. I'll be back and I will discuss Mary as the model of femininity. Are you tired of educational options that are one size fits all? Our sponsor, Colby Academy, offers the flexibility of both accredited online and traditional school-at-home options to fit the needs of your child. Visit relevantradio.com/Colby.
So, what's trending? Bridging your Catholic faith with your everyday life. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie on Relevant Radio and the Relevant Radio app.
And I've asked you the question, what challenges do women face today in the culture? And there are so many things I think we could discuss, but it's been fascinating to hear. It's fascinating to see what we have ahead of us that many people are experiencing in the culture today. And as I was looking at some of the responses, I heard from Ashley on Instagram, Ashley Gallenstein. She said, women are looked down on if they want a man to help to support a household or to defend them. It's interesting. It's something that we should understand and see, that as a culture today, if a woman says that she wants a man to support or defend her, that is something to take offense at. And I think that that's so heartbreaking to hear and see, that this is something that's happening today in our culture, that women are looked down upon for saying, hey, I need you to protect me, or hey, I need you to help so that financially we can be a family, so that financially I can be a mom and be present to my child. Isn't that sad that women are looked down upon for thinking or desiring that? It's just a brief comment. I remember when my husband and I weren't even dating yet. We were driving back from one class and we're talking about what we wanted to do in our future. And I said, well, I want to be a stay-at-home mom. But really? That was an anomaly to him. It was incredible. It was exciting for him to hear. He said, I've never heard someone say that before. And to him, that was something so attractive, but it was so shocking. I remember years later, we still talk about that moment, because a lot of people today are not willing to say that, because for some reason it's viewed as less than, and people are looked down upon, and some people are viewed as achieving nothing. And yeah, sure, you can say, okay, Timmerie, well, you have, a national radio show, la da da. Yeah, that's great, but I've said this time and time again, and I will tell you again, if at any point my radio show gets in the way of being a wife and a mother, and it will at one point, as we have more children, God's timing, He will provide and help determine that timing. But it's important that we understand that we should not be afraid for people to look at us and say, well, look at everything you gave up. I think of Dolores Hart, the actress Dolores Hart. She was in films with Elvis. She was in many of the films during the golden age of Hollywood. She was slated to be like the next big thing in Hollywood. Guess what? She gave it all up. She became a religious sister. She's a nun today. She has a book, I believe it's titled Ear of the Heart. I highly recommend checking it out, especially if you love old Hollywood and the history and all the movies. She talks about so much of what happened. And people in the eyes of society seemingly thought she was insane. Look at what she gave up. And I think that is a challenge we have, is when we have to ignore that cultural narrative that make us afraid to say that we want to have a man support a household or defend us. Another thing, It's Me on Instagram commented, she said, women can't afford to be at stay-at-home moms on one income today, especially in Southern California. You can't even buy a house. She said, this is a problem and a challenge women face today. Oh, and that means that if you want to be at stay-at-home, if you want to buy a house, that might mean you have to move across the country. Now, we hope dearly to go back to Southern California to be near family because our family's here, but I get it. And this is part of the reason why we're living in the Midwest now, so that we could own a home, so we could be financially stable and not dependent financially on a lifestyle that would make it so that neither my husband or I would ever be around our child or around one another. These are real challenges that women face today, but we have to be willing to make life adjustments. And sometimes for seasons, ones that aren't always easy. M4 Plus on Instagram said, one of the challenges women face today is judgment for having more than the perfect 2 children. Isn't this true? That if you have more than 2 children today, you are looked down upon. I remember my mom, we have 4 kids in our family, and people would look, wow, how you can have more? How many do you have? And I know so many people, so many pro-life people have said this. Okay, which one do you want me to get rid of? Which one would you have liked me to abort? The fact that people can even comment that this is a pro-life people, it shouldn't even be something we take seriously anymore. We shouldn't even be afraid of it. This is such a nasty and disgusting attitude to have as a culture. Don't buy into it, even if it comes at times from our family. There's one of those moments where you just have to say, well, okay, you can say that, but it means nothing to me. And I think that sometimes that's the hard thing, is that when people we care about have opinions, they can hurt, but we have to grow thick skin if we are going to be faith-filled Catholics today in a culture that radically disagrees with how we are meant to live as people created in God's image and likeness with a purpose. Kat Pellet had 2 interesting comments on Instagram when she talked about the challenges women face today. She said, for middle-aged women, caring for aging parents while basically doing it all has become a challenge. There have been actually even so many interviews. I remember seeing an interview years ago. Here this woman was. She was working full time still. Her kids were in high school. She was trying to run to every extracurricular activity possible. She still had to walk the dog, make dinner, and check in with her parents who were aging and coming along with various ailments and doctor's visits, and she was exhausted. And, this is the crisis that many middle-aged women find themselves in because they were told you have to have it all, you can have it all. But instead we feel this massive dichotomy and fragmented selves that we don't even know ourselves anymore. And then for young women today, the crisis of even being able to find a spouse, finding the right person to marry. You see, these crises in the culture are a reminder that we need to be willing to sacrifice some things that the culture is offering, that the world is offering, to rediscover who we are and what God is specifically calling me to in the midst of my gifts as a woman. Rather than following every narrative that Twitter offers, rather than following every narrative that I received and heard about in my education, from my family, who am I as a woman? What are my particular gifts, both as a woman and as an individual? What do I have to offer the world? And where has God placed me at this time in history? There's so many challenges that women face today. I've been fascinated to hear many of your comments and thoughts, but I do want to recommend a podcast. We'll put a link to it in the podcast notes for today's show on challenges women face. And one that I highlighted that I think is very important that we discuss is the challenge women face today surrounding conversations as teenagers and going into college surrounding education, student loan debt, and work, and how the education projection and the pressure to go directly from education to career is stymieing growth in women, stymieing families, marriages, our fertile years. And so this is a conversation we must have a larger conversation about. So I really hope, in light of International Women's Day, you will go and listen to that podcast. We'll include a link to that in the podcast notes. Just to subscribe to the podcast at relevantradio.com/trending, or wherever you catch your podcasts, we are there. And we talk about how abortion and contraception play a role in this, because abortion and contraception, in light of the educational track, the career track focus for women, abortion and contraception are necessary because that's how you will continue on, but it's robbing women of motherhood, of potential spouses. It's robbing them of their happiness because of post-abortion syndrome, and it's robbing them of our health when we buy the lie of hormonal contraception and the damage it's ravaging in our bodies. So at the heart of this, the question is, where do we go? How do we find an answer to rediscover the lost understanding of who we are as women? I think that the place we have to go to is the Blessed Virgin Mary. She is the model of femininity. When we hear stories from those who have received apparitions of Our Lady over the last couple hundred years, one of the things often commented on, especially, I even just think of Our Lady of Fatima just a little over 100 years ago. The visionaries would comment and ponder how beautiful Our Lady was. And we talked about beauty earlier today on the show. Beauty not simply and only focused on the physical dimension, but they saw the penetrating beauty of who she was. This is a reminder for us that we must return to a life of virtue. We must return to a life united with Christ. I think of the very last words that the Blessed Virgin Mary spoke in all of sacred scripture. We find at the wedding feast at Cana. What does Our Lady tell us? She tells us, do whatever he tells you. That is, do whatever her Son Jesus Christ tells us. Follow his commandments. Live according to the nature he has in store for us and the purpose, the ultimate end he has in store. And personify the very virtues she herself lives out. Humility, temperance, virginity, gentleness, chastity, self-possession, self-control, thoughtfulness, amiability, kindness, being slow to anger, pure and generous. These very virtues that society would reject, we can embody. So you're listening to Trending with Timmerie here on Relevant Radio during International Women's Day. I want to encourage you to share this via podcast. You can subscribe wherever you catch your podcast, relevantradio.com/trending, to help take back the culture of femininity that has been lost in the face of ideas and days such as International Women's Day that become about abortion, that are the exact opposite of who and what we are as women. And pray to Our Lady as the model of femininity for all. You're listening to Trending with Timmerie. A shout out and a huge thank you to Lucas Holt, our technical producer. Ask you to pray for him and his family as they move on to new beginnings from here at Relevant Radio. This is Timmerie from Trending with Timmerie. Sam from the Catholic Gentleman will join me for our weekly Gentleman's Hour as we talk about St. Joseph, and we'll also discuss with Sam from the Catholic Gentleman the call for men to be saints and the mental shift necessary to follow the path with Christ. Join me Wednesday at 6 p.m. Central on Relevant Radio or the Relevant Radio app.